Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to HTML5. It's going to be fairly introductory, so if you're familiar with HTML5, these might be a little bit of a review, but hopefully we can make it somewhat practical for you and maybe give you some new tips and tricks to be able to use. I'm Jason VanLue. I'm the lead designer at Envy Labs in Orlando, Florida, home of Disney World. And we also produce a product called Code School. You may have heard of that, where we create courses to help both designers and developers learn how to code better. And this is actually a course that we have on Code School. It's called 345. And basically we go through all of the nuts and bolts of HTML5 and CSS3. So if you are interested, that's available online. We can kind of go through some more details of what we cover today. So I'll be pulling some content from that course specifically today when we talk about HTML5, and then also CSS3 later on in the day as well. All right, so with HTML5, you might be familiar that when this kind of came out, that sort of replaced the old kind of HTML4. We have a lot of new tags on the block, a lot of new tags that have been introduced to the HTML5 spec that we can now use in our document outline. And here's just a few that we're going to kind of go through today in more detail. So we've got obviously the header tag, we've got the nav, section, article, aside, and footer, and we'll also cover a few more of those tags. And really the main goal of these new tags and kind of HTML5 as a whole is to better organize our document structure. Obviously we were able to do that before with naming our divs, IDs and classes, and being able to organize our markup. But HTML5 really makes this a lot simpler for us. It makes it a lot more intuitive, and it allows us to create documents and document outlines that are really just much better organized. So let's dive in and let's first cover just kind of some generic things that are different in HTML5. Obviously, if you're writing in the old HTML, HTML4, or earlier, you'd probably be used to something like this, putting this up at the top of your document. Well, HTML5 makes it a lot easier now. That's all we have to type in. So whereas before, it was usually a copy and paste kind of thing. Even I can remember to type that in without even having to copy and paste. So it makes it a lot easier now to define what it is that we're actually creating and to actually define our doc type. Additionally, kind of as we keep into some of the more generic features, this is what we would have had to declare before for our HTML elements, and now in HTML5 it becomes a lot simpler. All we have to do is declare the language that we're in. We don't need the other unnecessary items there. And then in our head elements, when we talk about our character set, we can simplify that quite a bit as well. We don't necessarily need to have this additional information. We can just declare what character set we're using. And then finally, when we're actually defining things like style sheets or JavaScript, before we would have to actually define what it is that we're linking to, the link to that particular page or style sheet, and then define what it actually is that we're creating. Now we can actually leave out that last part. The browser is going to recognize what it is that we're creating. So once again, this just allows us to remove a lot of unnecessary items up at the top of our document, making it a lot easier to organize our document outline. So as we start diving into some of the new tags, obviously the header tag is a group of introductory or navigational aids. And what you'll find with HTML5, which is very nice, is that all of the new tags, all of the new elements are very intuitive. It's sort of like how we've been creating sites or how we used to create our document outlines, and they've sort of taken those best practices and put them into a spec. So in this case, this would be an example of a header. And so previously we might have defined our header to look something like this, div ID header or div class header, with an H1 inside. And now with HTML5, we can make this a lot more intuitive. We can actually define our H1 inside of our header tags, and instead of having to do a div ID header, now we can just declare that as a header. And we can also use headers in multiple places on the page, and that makes it kind of interesting as well. Now, this is one of those practices that is okay to do as part of the spec. It's certainly valid HTML5, but you might not necessarily want to do it in your document outline. And what I mean by that is you can actually put headers throughout your page if you wanted to define, say, a header in one of your sections, which we'll cover here in a minute, or if you wanted a header somewhere else, maybe on a sidebar element or those types of things. You can define it in multiple places on a page. But the problem there is all of a sudden you have a lot of H1s on your page. And so again, it's valid HTML5. It will validate, but it's up to you kind of how you want to organize your document outline. But that is available to you. As we kind of keep on this theme, we have the H group tag, which is new also in HTML5. And this kind of got a little bit of bad treatment. It started out in the HTML5 spec, and then they removed it. And then they put it back in. And then I think they even removed it again and put it back in again. So it's kind of gone back and forth and back and forth. But essentially what it is what it sounds like. It's a group of content within a header. So what we can do is we can put our H1s and our H2s inside of an H group. And we can include those inside of header elements. Those don't necessarily need to be inside of header elements. You could include those just inside of a section or inside of a div. But again, it's a better way of organizing our markup. So if we have a situation where maybe in our header elements on our page we have, say, a logo, maybe we have some secondary logo information, we have a tagline, we might even have some other information up there in the header. If we have a lot of information that needs to be included in our header elements, we can better organize it using the H group tag. So next is the Nav tag in HTML5, and a Nav tag is defined by the spec as a section of the page that links to other pages on the site. It's pretty simple. It's a navigation area. We all kind of know what that is. And so obviously we have navigation areas up at the top of our page. We can also include those as sidebars. What's really nice about this is we can define in our markup now what are navigational list items or what are necessarily just plain old list items. Whereas before we might have had to say, you know, div ID navigation and then include our ULs in that. Now we can include our navigational list items inside of nav tags and then move the rest of our list items into separate places on the page. So just as an example, as I mentioned, here's what we might have done previously. Div ID navigation with our unordered list. And then our list elements contained within that. Now we can move that into just our nav tag. And again, with all of these tags, you can still define IDs and classes. As you'll see in a minute when we look at kind of a practical example of this, we can still apply our IDs and classes in our CSS. So you can style these differently. You can have multiples on the page, multiple nav sections on the page, style those differently by adding classes and IDs and those types of things. Okay, next we've got our section tag, and you've already seen this a couple times in the examples. And a section is a grouping of content based around a theme. Now, a section, it can replace some of your div elements if you want it to, but it must be able to stand alone. And so we need to remember when we're using this that it needs to be content that is related around a particular theme. So in other words, if you are using a section, say, instead of a div, sometimes we do things like div ID content or div ID sidebar, those kinds of things. If we have a section that all of the content contained within that is around the same sort of idea or the same theme, then we can use a section. And what's nice about this is, once again, it just allows us to better organize our markup. So before, we might have done something like this. Now, I come from the US. I'm a big basketball fan. I don't know, is basketball big over here in Germany? No, it's probably more soccer, right, or football? Yeah. Which I am terrible at soccer, although my 6-year-old son loves it. So who knows? Maybe he'll get into it. So anyway, so here's what we might have marked up before. We have a div ID. We've got an H2 element, an H3, and then a paragraph. And basically, this is just a little div here where we're including content that's related around this theme about basketball. And so if we move this now into HTML5, you can see that we've changed out our div ID ACC news, and we've added our section tags. You'll also notice that we've added our header as well. Now again, that's one of those examples that you can add a header to that particular section if you feel that that better organizes your content. But once again, in doing that, you're going to be adding multiple H1s on your page. So it's sort of up to you how you want to organize your markup and if that's something that you want to do. But this is valid HTML5, and now we can once again organize this, this whole section better. Next we have our article tag, and the article tag is stated as an independent self-contained composition. So we would use the article tag for things like news posts, magazine articles, user comments, things like that. Now a section can contain multiple articles, so we can put articles inside of a section and we can have multiple articles contained in that. So for example, once again, we have our div ID ACC news. This would be our old sort of markup that we would use. And if we were to mark that up now in HTML5, notice once again we've changed out our div with our section, and then we've added an article tag there to include now that particular piece of information that is relatively self-contained. So remember, with an article, whereas with a section it's a grouping of related content, an article is something that's independent, that can stand alone. And a good way to kind of remember this, this is from Andy Clark, who wrote Hard-Boiled Web Design. And he says that one way to check if article is the most appropriate element is to see if an article's content makes sense on its own. So for example, would it make sense on its own when viewed in an RSS reader, like Reader for the iPad? So that's sort of a good way to think about an article tag and how you might use it, is can it stand on its own if I'm seeing this piece of content in another, say, context or on another device? And that can kind of help you organize your markup. So now we move on to aside, the aside tag. And the aside tag originally was spec'd as content related to an article but not critical to its understanding. So this could be like pull quotes, call outs. If you have maybe an article on the page and you have a little quote on the side, or you have something related to that article that's styled over on the side, that would be contained in an aside tag. So as you can see, we have the same content that we've been working with. So now we have our paragraph content here, and then we have a little aside. And the aside is something that you don't necessarily need to know, but it sort of helps give a little bit more style to the article. That's sort of what it was when it first came out in the spec. They've since sort of expanded the definition for aside, that now you can actually use it as sort of secondary content. So you can use the aside tag for, say, a sidebar, or you can move the content that's contained within the aside tags outside of an article. So before, the aside tag usually had to be contained within an article because it was related to that particular piece of content. Now, really, you can use the aside tag outside of that, and you can use it sort of on its own. So typically, when you're working with HTML5, and if you're building something like a blog, it makes sense to keep the aside tag within your articles if, say, you're creating blog posts or those kind of things. But you can also use it, say, to create a sidebar if you have maybe navigation in there or those type of things. So next we move on to the time tag, and you might be familiar with this. So essentially, what we can do with the HTML5 time tag is, and this comes in handy once again when we're creating things like blog posts or news items, those type of things. If we want to actually give a time where something was published or something was written or those type of things. So you'll notice that we have our time tag up there, and we've actually included date time, which basically what we're telling the browser is, okay, this is when this particular piece of content was published. And then you'll notice we have that little pub date at the end, and essentially what that did is that told the browser this is an actual published date. If you didn't use that, you could publish a date that wasn't necessarily the date that was published. They've since removed that from the spec as valid HTML5. This whole kind of thing was actually written last year, so we've had to kind of go back through and edit some things and take some things out. So now essentially what we have is, sorry about that. So as you can see, we just removed the pub date element. Everything else stays the same. But once again, this is a nice way of organizing our content, letting the browser know what sort of content we're producing. And this also helps too with the rise of things like RSS readers, and if you do a lot of your reading and a lot of those type of things outside of, say, a particular site, if you're doing things like on an RSS feed, it helps provide more information related to the content that you're actually publishing or that you're actually reading. Another new tag that we've got in HTML5 is the figure tag. It shows up here. So my remote gets very ambitious sometimes. There we go. So the figure element represents a unit of content, optionally with the caption that we'll talk about in a minute, that is self-contained. Once again, this is sort of one of those things in HTML5 that you sort of understand just by reading the title of it. With figure, we also have something called fig caption. And the fig caption element represents a caption or a legend for that particular figure. It's optional, you don't have to use it, and it can appear before or after the content that's contained within the figure. But within that figure, only one fig caption element can be nested. So that's a lot of information. Let me kind of give you an example here. So in this case, we've got this cute little picture of a monkey up here. And so we can actually put this inside of a figure. And so you can see we're using our figure tag with an image included in there. And then we've also included a fig caption, so we can provide a little bit more information about the image that we're using. And then once again, it just better organizes that particular piece of mockup. Additionally, if we're showing things like code, or if we're writing a blog post or those kind of things, and we want to show some different things as sort of call-out features, we can use the figure and fig caption tags to do some of those things as well. And so kind of wrapping up some of these new tags, obviously footer includes information that closes out a particular section. This is another one of those fairly easy, fairly intuitive tags in HTML5. It doesn't have to be only at the bottom of the page, though. We can add this tag to sort of any containing element. So just like we can do with header, we can do the same with footer in the sense that we can close out, say, if we have section elements that we're using, or those type of things, we can use footer in multiple places on the page to sort of close out the content that we're actually creating. So before, this is how we might have marked up something with, once again, div ID footer, just like navigation or just like our header items. And we can add our H3 and our paragraph copy there. This would be at the bottom of the page. And then simply in HTML5, just like some of the other tags, makes it very easy just to add those as well. And then again, just another example of how we can use this particular element in other areas than just the bottom of our page. All right, so what I'd like to do now is sort of get a little practical, because that might have been fairly review for you. And so we'll just kind of show what we're talking about in kind of a real site. So this is a fictional site that we created for the course. So essentially what we're doing here is we're building a brew house, which I'm a big fan of beer, so being in Germany, I love German beer. It's great. I wish we had as good a beer as you guys have over here back in the States. We don't. So we're building this site for a little restaurant, and we've got some common items that we might see on a website. We've got our header up there at the top. We've got our logo items. We've got our main navigation, large image, some call-out features over there on the side listing what we sort of have, and then we have kind of these sections here at the bottom. So let's kind of briefly go over how we might mark up those kinds of things. So just to kind of go through this quickly, as you can see, we've got it a lot simpler up here in our head element. Obviously, our doc type becomes a lot simpler. Some of those things that we talked about at the very beginning, we can really simplify that piece of the site. And then as we start getting into our main content, as you can see, we can still use divs, and those are still obviously needing to be used in our markup. But now we've sort of changed out some of those main pieces of content. So instead of div ID header, we've got our header element up here at the top. And once again, as I mentioned before, you can add IDs and classes to better style out your information. And then we've got our main navigation item, which includes all of our main list items there. And then we've actually included, so our main promotional item there that you saw with the big image of the beer and the sort of call-out text there on the side, we're going to include that in a section because all of that is related to a common theme. It's related to the type of beer that that particular restaurant has, so we're going to group that together. And then as we go down and sort of define those other blocks of information, as you can see, we've got 3 blocks, but we've got different content contained within. And so the first section we can group together with news. The second section down here we can group together with specials. And as we go back up to news, you can see here's where we can use things like our article tag. We can use things like our time tag, and you can see this was built before that was removed, so I actually need to remove that because that's not right anymore. But you can see kind of how we might apply that to a box where we're listing out news items or those kind of things. And then we have our newsletter box there at the right. And finally, we close out with our footer information. So fairly simplistic. You know, HTML5 is kind of one of those things as you start getting into it where you'll realize it's a lot more intuitive and how you probably have been building sites. And so it just continues to make a lot of sense to be able to use it. So to kind of wrap up, talk a little bit about the compatibility factor. Obviously, that's still a big key when designing for the web, and we need to make sure that our sites are continuing to work. So as we look and see sort of what is valid, obviously all of the big stars, HTML5 is already valid in those main browsers. Anything less than IE8, obviously, it's not going to be valid. So what do we do? Well, before sort of the past year, obviously we've come a long way. Before, we would include Remy Sharp's HTML5 shiv. You kind of saw that at the top of my little example site there. And basically what that does is anything below IE9, it's going to define those HTML5 elements for us using JavaScript so that anything, if it's IE8 or IE7, we're still going to be able to use those tags in our markup. But now we can use Modernizer. You're probably familiar with Modernizer. It actually includes Remy Sharp's HTML5 shiv as part of it. But what's nice about this is you can sort of define what elements you're using in your site, and you can build a custom Modernizer script that you can include so it can be as large or as small as you need it to be. So what's nice about this is not only can you define your HTML5 elements that you might be using for your site, but you can also define a lot of your CSS3 elements, and we'll talk about that later in the day. But what's really nice about that is a lot of times we use CSS3 elements, but we don't use all of them. And so if we have this really large JavaScript file that we're always pulling down to sort of allow those to be included or allow those to be shown in browsers, it's nice to be able to kind of define which ones we're actually using, minimize our page load time, minimize the amount of time that the browser's having to download those files. So Modernizer is definitely one of those things that needs to be included in your site if you are building sites in HTML5 and using CSS3. So that's it. Like I said, fairly simple, fairly simplistic in terms of the new elements in HTML5. Certainly if you have any questions, let me know, or if there's anything more advanced that would be helpful for you. But certainly thanks for coming and listening to me.